Demosthenes, the man who made it impossible to quit. You do not hate yourself because of what the world did to you. You hate yourself because of what you keep doing to yourself. Every single day. In the small, quiet moments when nobody is watching, there is a version of you that makes a promise in the morning and breaks it by afternoon. That sets an alarm and hits snooze. That opens a blank page and closes it. That says tomorrow and means never. And every time that happens, something registers deep inside you. Now, not as failure, not as laziness, but as evidence. Evidence that you are someone who cannot be trusted, not by other people, by yourself. That is where the rot begins, not in your childhood, not in your circumstances, in the gap between what you said you would do and what you actually did. This is the story of a man who understood that mechanism 2,000 years before anyone had words for it, and who did something so extreme, so psychologically ruthless, that it changed the course of an entire civilization. In ancient Athens, power did not belong to soldiers, it belonged to speakers. The man who could move a crowd in the public assembly, who could hold thousands of people in the grip of his words, was the most powerful man in Greece. Generals needed orators, politicians needed orators. Wars were won and lost on the floor of the Pnyx hill, before a single sword was drawn. Demosthenes was born into that world knowing he would never belong to it. He was frail, he was awkward. He had a speech impediment so severe that when he opened his mouth, the sounds that came out were weak, slurred, and nearly incomprehensible. When he stood before a public crowd for the first time as a young man and tried to deliver a speech, they laughed at him, not politely. They mocked him openly until he left the stage in humiliation. Most men would have taken that as their answer. They would have decided, quietly and reasonably, that this particular path was not for them. They would have found something else. They would have told themselves they had tried. Demosthenes went home and made a decision. Not a motivational decision, not a hopeful decision. A precise, mechanical, almost cold-blooded decision about exactly what it would take to rebuild himself from the inside out. He left Athens entirely. He found a cave near the shore and he moved into it. He was not running away. He was removing every escape route. He filled his mouth with small stones and practiced speaking through them, forcing his tongue and jaw to work against resistance until the words that came out, even obstructed, came out clear. He ran up steep hills reciting verses of poetry until his lungs stopped quitting before his mind did. He practiced speeches in front of the water, using the noise of the waves as his crowd, learning to project until his voice cut through something larger than itself. He did this every day, and he knew the danger. He knew that discipline is not a feeling. He knew that there would be mornings when the cave felt unbearable, and Athens felt close, and the temptation to walk back up the road and tell himself he had done enough would be almost impossible to resist. He had watched himself his entire life negotiate with that temptation. He knew exactly how persuasive it was. So he picked up a razor and he shaved exactly half of his head. One side bare to the skin, the other side untouched. He made himself look so strange, so impossible to explain, that walking back into Athens before the work was done became more painful than staying. He had engineered his own trap. He had made the promise physically impossible to break, without the breaking being visible to everyone he knew. He stayed in that cave for months. When his hair finally grew back evenly and he walked back into Athens, he was not the same man who had left. He stood before crowds that had once laughed him off the stage, and he held them completely still. His voice filled the assembly. His arguments dismantled his opponents before they could respond. He became the man that Philip of Macedon, the most feared conqueror in the world at the time, identified as his single most dangerous enemy in all of Greece. Not a general, an orator. The man who had been laughed off a stage had become the voice that held an empire at bay. Here is what Demosthenes actually understood, and why the half-shaved head matters more than any technique he practiced in that cave. He understood that self-esteem is not a feeling you wait for. It is not something the world gives you after enough success. It is a record. Your mind keeps a running account of every promise you make to yourself and whether or not you kept it. Every time you keep the promise, the record improves. Every time you break it, the record worsens. And you cannot lie to that record. You cannot tell it positive things and expect it to update. It only responds to action. Demosthenes had a broken record when he left Athens. Years of watching himself fail in public, years of knowing his voice was wrong, years of evidence stacking up that he was not someone who could be counted on to do the hard thing. The cave was how he started a new record. Every morning he put the stones in his mouth when he did not want to. He made a deposit. Every hill he ran when his lungs burned, he made a deposit. Every day he stayed when the road back to Athens looked easier, he made a deposit. The shaved head was not a gimmick, it was an act of absolute self-knowledge. He knew that his own willingness to negotiate with himself was the enemy, not the speech impediment, not the crowd that had laughed, not the culture that valued oratory. His own capacity for self-betrayal was the thing standing between who he was and who he needed to become. So he removed the option. You do not need a cave, you do not need to shave your head, but you need to understand what Demosthenes understood. The person you are trying to convince is not the crowd. It is not your employer, your family, or anyone watching. It is you. And you already know every promise you have made and broken. You have been keeping score your entire life, even when you pretended not to. The only way to change the score is to stop negotiating with yourself and start treating your own word as something that cannot be undone once it is given.